Somehow the thought reassured him. He had a picture of scientists, naturalists, technicians, and all those chaps they called the backroom boys summoned to a council. They'd be working on the problem now. This was not a job for the government, for the chiefs of staff. They would merely carry out the orders of the scientists. They'll have to be ruthless, he thought. Where the trouble's worse, they'll have to risk more lives if they use gas. All the livestock too, and the soil, all contaminated. As long as everyone doesn't panic. That's the trouble. People panicking, losing their heads. The BBC was right to warn us of that. Upstairs in the bedrooms, all was quiet. No further scraping and stabbing at the windows. A lull in battle. Forces regrouping. Wasn't that what they called it in the old wartime bulletins? The wind hadn't dropped, though. He could still hear it roaring in the chimneys, and the sea breaking down on the shore. Then he remembered the tide. The tide would be on the turn. Maybe the lull in battle was because of the tide. There was some law the birds obeyed, and it was all to do with the east wind and the tide. He glanced at his watch. Nearly 8 o'clock. It must have gone high water an hour ago. That explained the lull. The birds attacked with the flood tide. It might not work that way inland, up country, but it seemed as if it was so out this way on the coast. He reckoned the time limit in his head. They had 6 hours to go without attack. When the tide turned again, around 1:20 in the morning, the birds would come back. There were 2 things he could do. The first to rest, with his wife and the children, and all of them snatch what sleep they could until the small hours. The second to go out, see how they were faring at the farm, see if the telephone was working there, so that they might get news from the exchange. He called softly to his wife, who had just settled the children. She came halfway up the stairs, and he whispered to her. "You're not to go," she said at once. "You're not to go and leave me alone with the children. I can't stand it." Her voice rose hysterically. He hushed her, calmed her. "All right," he said, "all right. I'll wait till morning. And we'll get the wireless bulletin then, too, at 7. But in the morning, when the tide ebbs again, I'll try for the farm, and they may let us have bread and potatoes, and milk too." His mind was busy again, planning against emergency. They would not have milked, of course, this evening. The cows would be standing by the gate, waiting in the yard, with the household inside, battened behind boards, as they were here at the cottage. That is, if they had time to take precautions. He thought of the farmer, Trigg, smiling at him from the car. There would have been no shooting party, not tonight. The children were asleep. His wife, still clothed, was sitting on her mattress. She watched him, her eyes nervous. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. He shook his head for silence. Softly, stealthily, he opened the back door and looked outside. It was pitch dark. The wind was blowing harder than ever, coming in steady gusts, icy from the sea. He kicked at the step outside the door. It was heaped with birds. There were dead birds everywhere. Under the windows, against the walls. These were the suicides, the divers, the ones with broken necks. Wherever he looked, he saw dead birds. No trace of the living. The living had flown seaward with the turn of the tide. The gulls would be riding the seas now, as they had done in the forenoon. In the far distance, on the hill where the tractor had been 2 days before, something was burning. One of the aircraft that had crashed, the fire, fanned by the wind, had set light to a stack. He looked at the bodies of the birds, and he had a notion that if he heaped them, one upon the other, on the window-sills, they would make added protection for the next attack. Not much, perhaps, but something. The bodies would have to be clawed at, pecked, and dragged aside before the living birds could gain purchase on the sills and attack the panes. He set to work in the darkness. It was queer. He hated touching them. The bodies were still warm and bloody. The blood matted their feathers. He felt his stomach turn, but he went on with his work. He noticed grimly that every window pane was shattered. Only the boards kept the birds from breaking in. He stuffed the cracked panes with the bleeding bodies of the birds. When he had finished, he went back into the cottage. He barricaded the kitchen door, made it doubly secure. He took off his bandages, sticky with the birds' blood, not with his own cuts, and put on fresh plaster. His wife had made him cocoa, and he drank it thirstily. He was very tired. "All right," he said, smiling. "Don't worry. We'll get through." He lay down on his mattress and closed his eyes. He slept at once. He dreamt uneasily, because through his dreams there ran a thread of something forgotten. Some piece of work neglected that he should have done. Some precaution that he had known well but hadn't taken, and he could not put a name to it in his dreams. It was connected in some way with the burning aircraft and the stack upon the hill. He went on sleeping, though. He did not awake. It was his wife shaking his shoulder that awoke him finally. "They've begun," she sobbed. "They've started this last hour. I can't listen to it any longer alone. There's something smelling bad too, something burning." Then he remembered. He had forgotten to make up the fire. It was smouldering, nearly out. He got up swiftly and lit the lamp. The hammering had started at the windows and the doors, but it was not that he minded now. It was the smell of singed feathers. The smell filled the kitchen. He knew at once what it was. The birds were coming down the chimney, squeezing their way down to the kitchen range. He got sticks and paper and put them on the embers, then reached for a can of paraffin. "Stand back," he shouted to his wife. "We've got to risk this." He threw the paraffin onto the fire. The flame roared up the pipe, and down upon the fire fell the scorched, blackened bodies of the birds. The children woke, crying. "What is it?" said Jill. "What's happened?" Nat had no time to answer. He was raking the bodies from the chimney, clawing them out onto the floor. The flames still roared, and the danger of the chimney catching fire was one he had to take. The flames would send away the living birds from the chimney top. The lower joint was the difficulty, though. This was choked with the smouldering, helpless bodies of the birds caught by fire. He scarcely heeded the attack on the windows and the door. Let them beat their wings, break their beaks, lose their lives in the attempt to force an entry into his home. They would not break in. He thanked God he had one of the old cottages, with small windows, stout walls. Not like the new council houses. Heaven help them up the lane in the new council houses. "Stop crying," he called to the children. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Stop crying." He went on raking at the burning, smouldering bodies as they fell into the fire. "This'll fetch them," he said to himself, "the draught and the flames together. We're all right as long as the chimney doesn't catch. I ought to be shot for this. It's all my fault. Last thing, I should have made up the fire. I knew there was something." Amid the scratching and tearing at the window boards came the sudden homely striking of the kitchen clock. 3 a.m. A little more than 4 hours yet to go. He could not be sure of the exact time of high water. He reckoned it would not turn much before 7:30, 20 to 8. "Light up the Primus," he said to his wife. "Make us some tea and the kids some cocoa. No use sitting around doing nothing." That was the line. Keep her busy, and the children too. Move about, eat, drink, always best to be on the go. He waited by the range. The flames were dying, but no more blackened bodies fell from the chimney. He thrust his poker up as far as it could go and found nothing. It was clear. The chimney was clear. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Come on now, Jill," he said. "Bring me some more sticks. We'll have a good fire going directly." She wouldn't come near him, though. She was staring at the heaped, singed bodies of the birds. "Never mind them," he said. "We'll put those in the passage when I've got the fire steady." The danger of the chimney was over. It could not happen again, not if the fire was kept burning day and night. "I'll have to get more fuel from the farm tomorrow," he thought. "This will never last. I'll manage, though. I can do all that with the ebb tide. It can be worked, fetching what we need when the tide's turned. We've just got to adapt ourselves, that's all." They drank tea and cocoa and ate slices of bread and bovril. Only half a loaf left, Nat noticed. Never mind, though. They'd get by. "Stop it," said young Johnny, pointing to the windows with his spoon. "Stop it, you old birds." "That's right," said Nat, smiling. "We don't want the old beggars, do we? Had enough of 'em." They began to cheer when they heard the thud of the suicide birds. "There's another, Dad," cried Jill. "He's done for." "He's had it," said Nat. "There he goes, the blighter." This was the way to face up to it. This was the spirit. If they could keep this up, hang on like this until 7 when the first news bulletin came through, they would not have done too badly. "Give us a cigarette," he said to his wife. "A bit of a smoke will clear away the smell of the scorched feathers." "There's only 2 left in the packet," she said. "I was going to buy you some from the co-op." "I'll have 1," he said. "T'other we'll keep for a rainy day." No sense trying to make the children rest. There was no rest to be got while the tapping and the scratching went on at the windows. He sat with one arm round his wife and the other round Jill, with Johnny on his mother's lap and the blankets heaped about them on the mattress. "You can't help admiring the beggars," he said. "They've got persistence. You'd think they'd tire of the game, but not a bit of it." Admiration was hard to sustain. The tapping went on, and the new rasping note struck Nat's ear as though a sharper beak than any hitherto had come to take over from its fellows. He tried to remember the names of the birds. He tried to think which species would go for this particular job. It was not the tap of the woodpecker. That would be light and frequent. This was more serious, because if it continued long, the wood would splinter as the glass had done. Then he remembered the hawks. Could the hawks have taken over from the gulls? Were there buzzards now upon the sills, using talons as well as beaks? Hawks, buzzards, kestrels, falcons. He had forgotten the birds of prey. He had forgotten the gripping power of the birds of prey. 3 hours to go, and while they waited, the sound of the splintering wood, the talons tearing at the wood. Nat looked about him, seeing what furniture he could destroy to fortify the door. The windows were safe because of the dresser. He wasn't certain of the door. He went upstairs, but when he reached the landing, he paused and listened. There was a soft patter on the floor of the children's bedroom. The birds had broken through. He put his ear to the door. No mistake. He could hear the rustle of wings and the light patter as they searched the floor. The other bedroom was still clear. He went into it and began bringing out the furniture to pile at the head of the stairs should the door of the children's bedroom go. It was a preparation. It might never be needed. He could not stack the furniture against the door because it opened inward. The only possible thing was to have it at the top of the stairs. "Come down, Nat. What are you doing?" called his wife. "I won't be long," he shouted. "Just making everything shipshape up here." He did not want her to come. He did not want her to hear the pattering of the feet in the children's bedroom, the brushing of wings against the door.